The Thunderchild-class is a class of 5 vessels built for the Eldian Navy. After the test-bed Resurgence-class, essentially a scaled-down Thunderchild, proved the weaponry and internal systems sound and set back up the infrastructure for producing battleships. The first ships of the class were laid down in 2032. However, design work actually started all the way back in the early 2010s, before Eilstadt was even a country. Original design sketches were for a proposed battle fortress, the battleship equivalent of a super heavy tank, if you like. Initial inspiration was taken from the design but never built Montana-class and the Yamato-class, and incorporating modern design cues, such as an angled bridge/conning tower for reduced RCS and nuclear power. The Yamato-inspired funnel being, in fact, a cooling tower. Two things that also distinguish this design are, 1, the presence of intakes at the front and the nozzle at the rear for the ship's hydrojet propulsion, and 2, the absurd amount of side-facing underwater torpedo tubes along the length of the hull. These were present on both sides, and the overall idea of the vessel, which can be seen by the presence of these and numerous dual-purpose and anti-aircraft guns, was to take the late World War II idea of battleships being floating castles to the absolute limit. The ship was designed to have a notably wide beam in proportion to its length, similar to the Tennessee-class, allowing both for space for the torpedo tubes and for a layered bulkhead system to protect the vital machinery spaces inside the core of the vessel. The idea was for the vessel to wade into battle, taking fire from multiple enemies on all sides. Given that penetration of the armor would inevitably occur in such an environment, it was hoped the elaborate bulkhead and pumping systems would allow the ship to join and remain in action long enough for the tremendous firepower to quickly dispatch all surrounding enemies. The ship could then be safely repaired after the battle. It was theorized that an entire enemy fleet could be wiped out by just 1 or 2 of these vessels. Therefore, the ship being taken out of service for lengthy repair work after every major battle was considered acceptable, as it was hoped that the ship could essentially win the naval aspect of a war in one major battle, and wouldn't be needed for the remainder of the war, or at least a few months or even years' time, while the enemy rebuilds their naval forces. This strategy was, in effect, a supercharged Kantai-Kessen, with all the benefits and downsides. At this point in the design stage, befitting the idea that the ship would be an unsinkable, immovable object, the class was deemed the Jackson-class, after American Army General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and a 2-ship class is planned to be produced, these being the Jackson and the Langsdorff. However, as with many super battleship ideas of this type, the utter insanity of the design was eventually toned down. It was recognized that 1 or 2 super ships were essentially the naval equivalent of putting all your eggs in one basket. It was felt that a smaller, less obscenely armed class, with more ships in the class, would be a better use of resources, so the design was scaled down. This saw the deletion of all the torpedo tubes, the replacement of the hydrojets with the traditional propeller-type propulsion system, and an addition of another cooling funnel, and a much narrower beam. This was the point at which the name was changed to Thunderchild, in honor of the fictitious British warship from the book The War of the Worlds. With a much more speed-efficient hull and an all-or-nothing armor scheme, this was the Eldian Navy's closest attempt to follow directly on from where U.S. fast battleship construction ended. However, there were still some inefficiencies with the design. Having been a nation birthed from a war between the United States and China, but also being based on the east coast of the North American continent, the Eldian Navy had need of ships capable of handling the calmer waters of the Pacific and the slightly more cranky Atlantic, where the northern areas in particular can have some pretty nasty weather, which streamlined fast battleships such as the Iowas were known to have trouble with. Furthermore, it was felt that an all-or-nothing armor scheme, while idea at a time when every other navy had battleship-grade cannons, didn't make much sense in the modern age of the carrier-launched bomber and the guided missile. Furthermore, some of the dual-purpose battery didn't have the most ideal firing arcs, and so the design was once more iterated. The anti-aircraft suite was given a major upgrade in the addition of a tiered system to the dual-purpose guns, similar to such as found on U.S. fast battleships of the Second World War. These guns were all to be comprised of the venerable 5-inch 54, put into improved dual mounts for an increased rate of fire in both rapid fire and sustained fire modes, one gun alternating loading while the other fires. While the idea of the ships operating alone had long since been abandoned, and destroyers would escort the vessels as anti-aircraft and anti-missile screen, these weapons, when not employed against surface targets, would be the vessel's medium-range anti-aircraft defense. Short-range last-ditch anti-aircraft and anti-missile defense was to be handled by a smattering of phalanx CWIS, all with their own independent radars but also joined together to a central CNC computer, which would ensure maximum efficiency. For example, if multiple missiles are incoming, each phalanx would engage an individual missile, as opposed to every unit engaging one missile, then the next, and the next, and the next, until eventually you may have run out of time and the last missile has already struck the ship before you've gotten around to dealing with it. The armor was redesigned to a version of a distributed scheme. Armor thick enough to defeat anti-shipping cruise missiles was deemed impractical. Instead, the shipboard CWIS, as well as the destroyers assigned to escort the vessel, would be the armor protecting against such threats. The entire ship, from bow to stern and every part of the superstructure, save obviously the masts and cabling and such, were armored to defend only against the largest common naval gun at the time, that being the Chinese 130mm. The ships retain a decent bomb deck, especially over the citadel where the power plant and CNC areas are. The hull was a move from speed towards seaworthiness. An Atlantic bow was fitted for rough seas, and aside from that, the bow and stern halves of the ship were mostly identical in terms of shape, more analogous to designs like the Bismarck's. With a length of 1,054 feet and a beam of 151 feet, the design was right in line with modern-day capital ships. Perhaps the biggest innovation with this final major design change, however, was with the construction. The superstructure in particular was designed with ease of manufacture in mind. Prodigious use of square and rectangular plates were employed, with as many squares and rectangles as possible being identical. So instead of, say, ordering 4 plates with these dimensions here, 2 plates with these dimensions there, 6 there, etc., the plates could be batch ordered and mass produced, decreasing both cost and the complexity of the build process. In particular, for the section of the second deck that supports the dual-purpose battery, 19 identical plates were used, and that's per side, meaning that each ship has 38 of these identical plates. Scale that up even further the entire class, and you can see how much benefit this brings in the cost department. Furthermore, since you're batch ordering anyway, a high amount of spares can also be kept at hand, and any heavily damaged plate can be repaired without the need to search warehouses and inventories for spares of one specific part that you only made 4 spares of because there's only one of these parts on each ship. Speed, due to the class being nuclear powered, it's classified. Maximum range of the main cannon is also at this point classified. However, we can get a rough conservative estimate using some basic calculations. The Thunderchilds are armed with 18-inch guns. These were decided upon as the largest caliber of shell that could be reasonably handled and loaded aboard a large battleship. Now, gun/cannon manufacturing technology has advanced quite a bit in the last few decades since the end of World War II. For example, we have the U.S. World War II M114 155mm howitzer with a maximum firing range of 14.9 kilometers or 9 miles. Compare that with his immediate successor, the M198 155mm howitzer, so same country, same caliber, now with a maximum firing range of 22.4 kilometers, 14 miles. That's a roughly 153% increase in range on the low end. So, knowing of course the guns are 18 inches, which isn't classified, plugging a 153% increase into the Yamato's 8-inch main gun with a maximum firing range of 42 kilometers, 26 miles, we get a maximum range of around 64.26 kilometers or 39.78 miles. And remember, that's on the low end. And comparing a World War II era gun with a gun developed not in the modern day, but that first entered service in 1979. It's likely that the main gun's actual range is much higher, but it's safe to say they at least have a range of 64 kilometers. And of course, with developments in modern fire control technology, they have a much greater chance of actually hitting anything at that range than World War II era ships had at hitting anything at their maximum ranges. But of course, accuracy statistics are also classified. The guns have a maximum elevation of 45 degrees, ammunition is a mix of high explosive, armor piercing, though of course this is mainly for bunker busting as opposed to engaging other ships, and again mimicking the Yamatos in style, though thankfully not in effectiveness, radar detonated flak rounds. The justification for these being that if the ship comes under air attack whilst no enemy surface vessels are around, it certainly wouldn't hurt to have some extra anti-air defense, and there's no downside to using these rounds, as unlike with the Yamatos, there are no open exposed crew positions aboard the Thunderchilds. Taking advantage of the leaps in automation and computer technology since the last battleships came online, the Thunderchilds have a remarkably low crew complement compared proportionally to late World War II battleships. A lot of the crew's jobs are simply to oversee and maintain the automated systems and act as manual backups in case of any malfunction. Initially, 3 ships of the class were laid down. After no major faults were found after the initial shakedown and active service cruises of the first 3 ships, 2 more ships were ordered and quickly laid down. The naming convention for the ships were, following Thunderchild's example, names from former naval powers around the globe that hadn't been used for battleships before, and for one reason or another, it was thought this needed to be rectified. And so, in order, they were Thunderchild, representing Great Britain, explained previously. Langsdorff, representing Germany, named after Captain Hans Langsdorff of the Admiral Graf Spee, known for adhering closely to the rules of war, treating prisoners well, avoiding unnecessary deaths, and ultimately scuttling his ship and saving his crew from what he thought would be a losing battle. Kanmusu, representing Japan, named after the Kanmusu or Fleet Girls of various Japanese media projects, which has kept the names and histories of World War II ships alive and brought an interest in naval history to younger generations who've never had a chance to serve aboard a battleship. Lee, representing the USA, named after Willis Lee, Vice Admiral in the U.S. Navy, one of the last and perhaps greatest battleship captains ever. And lastly, Montana, also an American name, but not to represent the USA. Instead, this name was chosen because throughout the entire Dreadnought era to the laying down of the Iowas, not a single U.S. battleship was named Montana, the only state never to have a battleship named after her, keeping in mind that Alaska and Hawaii were not states during this period. The initial 3 Thunderchilds, Thunderchild herself, Langsdorff, and Kanmusu, operated together as a unit, doing battle line exercises and training mostly confined to the Atlantic. Once the ships had proven themselves, however, and Lee and Montana were laid down, the trio were quickly separated. LDN naval strategy was, and still currently is, to use the battleships not only to project themselves as a true global power, but also to garner goodwill by helping deal with problems in the high seas, even when they aren't asked to. Langsdorff, fittingly enough, continued to operate in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, patrolling the coasts of Africa to deter piracy. She would never actually venture into territorial waters of another nation herself. Instead, frigates, corvettes, and other smaller vessels operating within these waters and under strict rules of engagement would patrol for suspected pirate activity. Upon sighting a suspicious vessel, said vessel would be hailed and ordered to stop so an LDN ship could approach and search the vessel. If the suspected pirate vessel ignored orders to halt and be searched, the vessel in question would promptly be blown to bits by a volley of 18-inch high explosive shells, which, due to their long range, were conveniently fired from international waters. This speak softly but carry a very menacing big stick that you are completely willing to use whenever speaking softly doesn't work approach resulted in an appreciable lull in pirate activity in whatever hotspots the Langsdorff was currently patrolling. It also resulted in a fair few international incidents, and highlighted just what level of brinksmanship Elstadt was willing to play in order to enforce their policy of standing up for what they think is right and stopping what they think is wrong, regardless of whether they technically had the jurisdiction to do so. Doing good by the everyman civilian population was deemed more important than pleasing bureaucrats and politicians. Thunderchild, perhaps understandably, remained close to home for national defense, whilst Kanmusu, also fittingly of her name, made her way to the Pacific to support the ongoing multinational liberation of the Philippines. Her fire support proved incredibly popular with troops on the ground, and by the time the operation was over, all 4 of her sisters were now on their way to meet up with her. Operating as a combined battle line at last, they are currently somewhere in the Pacific, sailing along with a massive naval fleet beneath the flags of 4 nations, all birthed in war from the former United States of America. Their mission is to end Chinese aggression once and for all, first by liberating Taiwan, reinstating the rightful Chinese government, then using that as a springboard for the final planned naval element of the campaign, the invasion and subsequent liberation of mainland China. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions. If I get enough questions, I actually will do a parody dry dock, as long as I don't get sued. They can be in-universe questions about the ship or the surrounding fictional lore, or they can be any real questions you have for me about this video or another video, or anything else completely unrelated that you might want to ask. Consider it a little Q&A. Bye for now.